Okay, so we've got a new toy to test out. We've got a Pentax K1000 old school fully manual film camera. We've been shooting with it for about a week. Well, actually, we haven't really been shooting with it. We've got 20 shots on it, kind of. We're gonna go out today to try to finish a roll of film so that we can give it to a film lab this Saturday, hopefully, and we'll get it back just in time before we go to Toronto so that we can learn to see, well, hopefully we'll learn from our mistakes. I don't expect too many to turn out well from this roll. Hopefully we get a couple good shots from this first roll. If not, no biggie. It's already a little late, so hopefully we'll still get a couple of good shots. See what happens.
Yeah, what time is it? 8:30?
No, it's 7.
Oh.
Like, this is supposed to be a pretty casual affair. It's not supposed to be, like, we're not doing any real professional work just yet.
Where are we going?
We're going to Long Hill Play in North Vancouver. It's a Monday, so it might not be as populated as we want it to be. Okay, so this shot here, I took a couple of weeks ago using the Sony. I'll try recreating it with this camera to see, well, on film to see what the difference is, what the editing process is like. I think it'll be a good comparison. Oh, actually, this cafe is pretty cute. Do you think this is worth a shot? Worth $2?
Yeah.
Yeah? The only electronic component of this camera is the light meter. So at least we have an indication of what exposure to go for. Right now we're shooting on a Ultra 400, the equivalent of ISO 400.
Is it still really dark?
It's pretty dark. Like f2, I'm having to go to 1/30th of a second for shutter speed. I think like with such a strong shutter, we're gonna screw up some shots.
Oh, we'll see.
The one thing that's going to be a very big problem for this type of fully manual camera, or film camera more specifically, is the ISO. You can't change the ISO setting.
Wait, I thought you can adjust the ISO.
Yeah, on the camera, but that's only the metering. So if you're shooting a roll of film and your film is an ASA 400 film, you have to choose whether you're going to shoot at the native ISO or if you're going to underexpose the film. But you can only have that choice is made at the beginning of the film, and you're stuck with it for the rest of your entire process until that roll is finished. Yeah, so we're shooting at 400 ISO for the rest of the day, and it's getting really dark. And I have way more film than I originally expected. I don't know if you can see this, but I'm on my 23rd shot, which means we have 13 more to go. Yeah, we never finished that roll of film that day. We had to go take another trip to a park to finish the rest of the shots. I think we took about 10 photos that day, about 7 of which I'm fairly happy with, which is admittedly much better than the keeper rate that I would get with digital. One of the major reasons I think we were so much slower with shooting film is because there is an inherent cost to shooting film. It costs me about $1.50 for every shot, and that includes the cost of the film and the development afterwards. But the fact that I'm able to slow down like that, I think is one of the main reasons we got into film in the first place. Going into this, I sort of knew the inherent cost in shooting film and how slow manual cameras sort of operate would help me slow down in my photography and help me be more intentional with my photos. And on top of that, the tactile feeling, the sound of the film advance and the heavy shutter in these cameras makes for a very satisfying shooting experience just in itself. Anyways, this is my first contact sheet, my very first contact sheet, and I was so excited to finally get it in my hands. But as you can see, there's a couple of shots that are very obviously overexposed, and there's a couple of shots that are very obviously underexposed, such as this one and this one here. And we'll talk about these, because I think it's actually fairly important to understand what overexposure and underexposure does to the film as compared to what you would normally expect in digital. And I'll post all the good results from this roll of film at the end of the video. Let's get into it. Let's talk about underexposed photos first in film. This photo is a great example. I purposefully underexposed this photo to capture the highlight in this shoe better. And this is something that I do often in digital photography, where if a highlight is overexposed, then you lose all of that information. But in film, when you underexpose a photo, you inherently increase the contrast in the photo and the colors become more saturated, but at the same time, the highlight becomes a little grungy, as you can see here. And when you do bring the exposure back to par, the graying structure in the darker areas of the film is made much more obvious, as you can see. Then we can take a look at an example where the film was overexposed. Overexposed film, I think, is a little more difficult to work with. For example, this one here. This film was overexposed when we were shooting in a park. The reason it was overexposed is because I forgot to check the meter when I took this shot. But what you can see is the colors are a lot more muted, but at the same time, you're not really losing as much detail as you would if you were shooting digital. Film retains the highlights a lot better than digital. You're just losing the contrast. And I think that leads us to the next point, which is that film actually has great dynamic range, I think. A shot that illustrates this is this one here. This girl was lying down at a bench in Robson Square, and I thought it was a really cool moment to capture. But what you can see in this shot is that there's a lot of dynamic range here. This roof is very shiny, and here down below in the trees, there is very dark shadows. Even though the film has lost some of these shadows, the roof is not overexposed. And I think this is a good representation as to how film actually performs. It maintains a lot of the highlights, but the shadows are a lot more contrasty and not necessarily neutral or flat as we would expect in digital photography. When exposed properly, I think film has very pleasant colors as well, depending on the film stock you choose, obviously. I was shooting with the Portra 400, and as you can see in this photo here, her skin tones are very neutral, and the sky in the background is a very pleasant and not offensive blue. And I think that's a testament to how some film stocks are designed to capture very neutral and pleasant colors, whereas other film stocks might be designed to capture very bold, very stylized colors. And that's something to experiment with once you get into this entire rabbit hole. A couple of notes on developing and scanning. Developing is a simple enough process for me because I'm not doing my own development yet. Color development is much more involved, and it's not something that I'm ready to dive into quite yet. So right now, I just unroll the film, walk into a shop, and hand the undeveloped film to a lab for them to process.
Hello, can I drop this off for developing?
Sure, no problem.
Scanning, though, is a completely different matter. Scanning is not something that I expected to take so much time and effort
when I first decided to take up film. That in itself warrants a completely different video, but I'll touch on it quickly here. These two photos are one of the same. They're mirrored because I've scanned them a little differently. When you're shooting film, it's like looking into a mirror. So the film itself is inherently reversed. And when you go to scan your film, you have to change the back. Anyways, the one on the left is produced by the scanner's default settings. The one on the right is scanned using a custom curves that I've input into the scanner. In the photo produced by the default setting, you can see that there's quite a bit more contrast and it's more akin to a finished product. Whereas the custom scan photo, I decided to keep much more information. If you look at the highlights, none of this information is blown out, whereas on the default settings, these highlights are blown out to white in the scan. This is a good illustration as to what scanning actually is in film photography. I think scanning to film is akin to raw development in digital photography. The raw file is just a set of data that you have to process into an image, and you can determine your own contrast, your own exposure. In film, that process is done at the scanning level. When you scan film, the amount of information you decide to keep will determine your final contrast level and whether you're losing your shadows and highlights. The white balance for the final product is also set at this stage. You can adjust it afterwards, but you have much less flexibility. As a side note to scanning, we did all of our scanning at the Vancouver Public Library. They have a couple of Epson V800 scanners that we could go and reserve. Well, anyone could reserve for digitizing film and photos. And I think that's a very helpful resource to look into when you're just getting started. If your local public library has this kind of service, I highly encourage you to use it. Before you decide to dive too deep and go get your own scanner, you should find out whether you actually enjoy doing the scanning yourself. Okay, that's enough talking from me. My results are right after this. Hopefully you guys like them, and I'll see you next time. Bye.